September 12th, 1943. Somewhere in occupied France, a man is running. He has been running for 3 hours. The farmhouse rendezvous is behind him now, blown, compromised by a Gestapo informant whose face he never saw, whose name he will never know. His wireless set is gone. His papers are gone. His contact is, in all likelihood, already dead. What he has left is a forged identity card, 40 francs in a coat pocket, and a uniform button sewn onto the second buttonhole of his jacket. He stops at a field margin, crouching low beneath a line of poplars. The sky above him is a flat grey, the sun entirely hidden. He has no map. He has no compass. He has, by any conventional reckoning, no way of knowing which direction leads south, towards Spain, towards survival. He has been walking in circles for the better part of an hour, and he knows it. He undoes the button from his coat. It is an unremarkable thing, dark blue, standard military cut, the sort found on 1,000 British uniforms. But he does not look at it the way a tailor would. He lays it flat on the back of his hand, so still that he is barely breathing, and he watches. Slowly, with the measured certainty of physics rather than luck, it swings, it settles, it points south. The man buttons his coat again and walks. This is the story of one of the most quietly extraordinary pieces of wartime engineering ever produced by the British military, a navigational instrument so perfectly concealed that it passed through Gestapo searches, border checks, and prisoner of war camp inspections without once being identified for what it was. The fly-button compass was not invented in a famous laboratory. It was not announced with fanfare. It was not celebrated in the press releases of any ministry. It was sewn onto the jackets of men and women whose names were kept from the public record for good reason, and it was designed to keep them alive when everything else had failed. It worked. And the story of how it came to exist tells us something profound about the nature of British ingenuity in the darkest of circumstances. To understand why the fly-button compass was necessary, you must first understand the world in which the agents of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, were asked to operate. The Special Operations Executive was established by Winston Churchill's directive in July 1940. Its purpose, famously summarized, was to set Europe ablaze. Less famously summarized was the extraordinary human cost of doing so. Agents were parachuted into occupied territory, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Poland, Yugoslavia, with fabricated identities, minimal support, and the near certainty that, if they were caught, no official body would acknowledge their existence. The Germans knew this. The Gestapo and the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, were relentlessly effective at unpicking networks, turning agents and following chains of contact until entire circuits collapsed. Survival in the field depended on two related things: not being caught and, when the net began to close, being able to move. Movement required navigation. Navigation required knowing where you were and, more importantly, which way you needed to go. Standard military compasses were clearly impossible. A brass, prismatic compass of the sort, issued to British officers, measured roughly 12 centimetres in length and weighed nearly 300 grams. It was precisely the kind of object that would end an agent's cover story the moment it was found in a pocket search. Even the smaller button compasses produced for aircrew, circular brass instruments roughly 3 centimetres in diameter, were recognizable to any trained German searcher. The Abwehr maintained detailed inventories of British escape and evasion equipment. They knew what to look for. What was needed was not a compass that could be hidden. What was needed was a compass that could not be recognized as a compass at all. These are not the same problem, and the distinction matters enormously. A hidden compass might be found. An unrecognizable compass could pass inspection indefinitely. The solution emerged from the workshops of MI9, the British military intelligence section responsible for escape and evasion, and more specifically from the remarkable mind of Christopher Clayton Hutton, known to his colleagues as Clutty, a former journalist and stage magician's assistant who had been recruited into military intelligence partly on the basis that he thought about problems the way nobody else did. Hutton's approach to the compass problem was, in retrospect, almost elegant in its simplicity. He did not ask how to hide a compass. He asked what objects agents already carried that could be made to function as compasses without appearing any different from their original form. The answer, it turned out, was right there on their clothing. The fly-button compass worked on the principle of magnetization. The conventional compass needle is simply a magnetized piece of metal, light enough to rotate freely on a pivot or to float on a film of surface tension if placed on water. Hutton and his colleagues realized that a standard uniform button, a flat disc of metal roughly 2 centimeters in diameter, could be magnetized in such a way that it would behave exactly like a compass needle when suspended correctly. The manufacturing process was, at its core, straightforward. Standard-issue uniform buttons were subjected to a strong magnetic field during production, which aligned the magnetic domains within the metal along a fixed axis. One side of the button, typically marked to those who knew by the direction of the thread groove, was magnetized as north, the other as south. The button was then indistinguishable by sight or touch from any other button of its type. It could survive laundering, it could survive handling, it could survive the kind of rough treatment that a garment inevitably receives when its wearer is crawling through hedgerows in the dark. To use the compass, an agent needed only 2 things: the button and a means of suspension. A button placed flat on a still palm would swing on the friction of its edge. A button suspended from a thread, any thread, including one pulled from the lining of the same jacket, would rotate freely and settle on the magnetic north-south axis. In field conditions with any wind, agents were instructed to float the button in a puddle or any still water where it would spin slowly and orient itself with an accuracy sufficient for practical navigation. It would not give a bearing to the nearest degree. It did not need to. What it gave was the cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. In the context of a man or woman trying to move generally southward towards a neutral border, that was more than enough. The buttons were produced, estimates suggest, though exact production numbers remain classified, in their thousands at facilities connected to MI9's supply network. They were incorporated into the standard uniforms issued to SOE agents before insertion, into the clothing prepared for RAF aircrew flying bombing missions over occupied territory, and into the escape kits assembled for prisoners of war. The key to their effectiveness was total integration. The magnetized buttons sat alongside identical unmagnetized buttons on the same garment. There was nothing to separate it visually from its neighbors. Only the agent knew which button, in which position, served a second purpose. The operational record of the fly-button compass is, by its nature, fragmentary. The whole point of the device was that its use went unrecorded. An agent who reached Spain would debrief their escape route, but the specific tools they used along the way were rarely the focus of that debrief. What we know comes primarily from post-war accounts, from the debriefs that did survive declassification, and from the recollections of agents who wrote memoirs in the decades following the war. What emerges from these accounts is not a single dramatic story, but a pattern of quiet utility. The fly-button compass appears in accounts of agents crossing the Pyrenees after circuit collapses in southern France. It appears in accounts of RAF aircrew who evaded capture after being shot down over the Low Countries and navigated their way through the Belgian escape lines to the Spanish border. It appears more obliquely in accounts from prisoners of war who used it during the preparation of escape attempts, establishing the direction of the perimeter fence relative to the distant border before they even began to dig. Psychological accounts from the field emphasize something the technical descriptions tend to miss. The morale value of the device was as significant as its practical value. An agent who had lost their papers, their contacts, and their wireless set had, by any objective measure, very few remaining assets. The knowledge that they had a functional compass sewn into their clothing, that they were not, in the most fundamental navigational sense, lost, provided a specific form of psychological anchor that is difficult to overstate. They could be hunted, they could be betrayed, but they could not be disorientated. They always knew which way was south. German interrogation records from the war, several of which were reviewed by British intelligence analysts after 1945, reveal that the fly-button compass was not discovered in searches during the conflict. This is the most direct evidence of its success. The Abwehr's comprehensive catalogues of known British escape and evasion equipment, catalogues that listed everything from trouser seam maps to bootlace wire saws, do not contain a reliable entry identifying the magnetized button. Either the Germans never recovered a specimen in a context that revealed its function, or they recovered it without understanding what they had found. Either outcome represents exactly the result Hutton and his colleagues intended. The Germans, for their part, were not without resources of their own in this domain. The Luftwaffe issued aircrew with small escape compasses, and captured examples were examined by British intelligence. The German button compass, produced in smaller quantities and primarily for aircrew rather than agents, was a genuine button-shaped instrument with a visible glass face and a floating needle concealed within a functioning coat button. It was, in engineering terms, more complex than the British version, a proper instrument that happened to look like a button rather than a genuine button that happened to function as an instrument. The distinction illuminates the different philosophical approaches of the two programs. German escape equipment, on the whole, was technically sophisticated, but required the user to know that a concealed instrument was present. The cuff compass, the trouser stud compass, the pen compass, these were all recognizable as compasses to anyone who looked closely and knew the type. British escape equipment, at its best, operated on the principle of total deniability. There was nothing to recognize as a compass because it was, in every visible respect, simply a button. American aircrew received British pattern escape equipment through much of the war, including magnetized buttons. Through the collaboration between MI9 and its American equivalent, MISX. The protocols and specific item designs were shared from 1942 onwards. American accounts of using button compasses in evasion episodes in France and the Netherlands are consistent with British accounts in their description of the device, suggesting that the British design was adopted without significant modification. The question of how much the fly-button compass actually changed the course of the war is one that historians approach with appropriate caution. The SOE's French network suffered devastating losses. The Prosper Circuit collapse of 1943 alone resulted in the arrest of several hundred agents and resistance members, and no navigational tool could protect against the network failures, security breaches, and double agents that caused those disasters. The button compass was not a strategic weapon. It was a tactical tool, small in scale, personal in application, and meaningful primarily in individual human terms. What it represented, however, was something larger. It embodied a distinctly British approach to the problem of irregular warfare, an approach that prioritized ingenuity over brute force, deception over confrontation, and the preservation of human life through misdirection rather than protection. In a war where the resources devoted to special operations were always limited and the human cost was always high, Devices like the fly-button compass reflected an institutional belief that the lives of agents were worth protecting through every possible means, including the ones that seemed almost too clever to take seriously. Several genuine wartime fly-button compasses survive in collections accessible to the public. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples alongside broader displays of MI9 escape and evasion equipment. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans holds American issue examples through its MISX collection. They do not look like much. They look exactly like buttons, which is, of course, the point. Return, then, to the field margin near the poplars. The sky is still grey. The man is still running. But he knows now which direction is south. He knows because a team of engineers and an ex-magician's assistant and the entire apparatus of British military ingenuity bent itself to the problem of keeping him alive in exactly this moment. They could not give him papers that would not be questioned. They could not prevent his network from being blown. They could not keep the Gestapo from his door or ensure that his contacts were not betrayed. But they could give him south. They could give him a fragment of certainty in a landscape of danger, a single fixed point around which all movement becomes possible again. They could sew it into his coat among buttons that were exactly like it, so that the enemy who searched him would feel the metal and count the holes, and see nothing remarkable, and send him on his way. This is what the fly-button compass was. Not a marvel of engineering in the conventional sense. It contained no complex mechanisms, no precision bearings, no miniaturized optics. It was a piece of metal magnetized in a factory attached to a jacket by a tailor who may not have known what she was sewing. Its operational window, in any individual case, was perhaps 30 seconds. The agent looked at it, learned what they needed to know, and moved. But in those 30 seconds, the difference between captured and free, between alive and dead, between a name on a memorial and a person who came home, turned entirely on a property of metal that had been arranged with great care and great purpose by people who understood that the most useful tools are sometimes the ones that are invisible until the moment they are needed. The man in the field reaches the Spanish border 11 days later. He does not mention the button in his debrief. Why would he? It was just a button. It was exactly a button. That was always the whole point.